in weight. And after the murder of George Floyd, we experienced a crest in the wave in terms of people being focused on issues of racial justice. And so that's why people are doing workshops like this and presentations like this, because that really brought to light some of the issues in our society, and people want to know more. People want to learn more. So I think that's a good thing. It was a tragic experience, but out of that tragedy, out of that trauma, you know, hopefully there has been some movement forward, and we hope to keep that movement going. So it's a buzzword that people are using, anti-racism, but what does it really mean, and what are people really talking about? And that's what we're going to cover tonight. So hopefully everybody will get a greater understanding of what it is. So I want to kind of do a check-in. I like to assess my participants and see where everybody is. So if you look at the bottom of your screen, if you roll your cursor down there, those of you who are on computers, in Zoom, you should get, it should pop up and you get your reactions. There's a little button that says reactions. So there's one on there that's a thumbs up. So actually you guys can do that, the thumbs up, maybe that's sort of raising your virtual hand. So I have on here, raise your hand, but you can give me your virtual hand if you've read at least one of these books. So go ahead and do that. Raise your virtual hand or give me the thumbs up if you've read at least one of the books on this list. So I have How to Be an Anti-Racist, Ibram Kendi, Stamped from the Beginning, also Ibram Kendi, White Fragility, Robert DiAngelo, Caste, Isabel Wilkerson, The New Jim Crow, Michelle Alexander, and Critical Race Theory by Kimberly Crenshaw. Okay, so I'm seeing quite a few either hand claps or thumbs up. So that gives me an idea of sort of where people are in terms of sort of maybe a little background that you have on some of the issues that we're going to talk about tonight. So for some of you, some of the information might be a little bit redundant if you've read any of these books, but hopefully we'll be able to have some open discussion about these ideas. And this is also my recommended reading list. This is sort of like, if you want to say racial justice or anti-racism 101. These are the books I recommend where people start. This gives you a good foundation. There's a lot of information out there, but if you start with these, you're off to a good start. All right, now I'm going to give you guys a little pop quiz. Again, just trying to assess where everybody is in terms of talking about these issues or understanding these issues. So again, I want you guys to use the thumbs up function on Zoom as we go through these questions. Okay, so we're going to do true or false, and if your answer is true, then I want you guys to give me the thumbs up in Zoom, okay? So here's our first one. Human beings have been divided into racial groups since the beginning of time. True or false? If that's true, give me the thumbs up. All right, your thumbs will disappear by themselves in a second. All right, so here we go. Question number 2, true or false? Scientific evidence supports the existence of different racial groups. True or false? If it's true, give me the thumbs up. Okay. Here's number 3. Most people who have racist ideas are horrible people. If that is true, give me a thumbs up. I see some laughter going on there. You guys like that question? All right, number 4. Being colorblind is the best approach to solving racism. If that is true, give me a thumbs up. Okay, and then last one in our pop quiz. The ultimate goal is to be non-racist. If that is true, give me the thumbs up. The ultimate goal is to be non-racist. All right, so that's our little pop quiz, or, if we do a pre-post test, that's our pre-test, kind of assessing again where everybody is, kind of what your thinking is or understanding in terms of these issues. And as we go through this evening, hopefully we'll get the answers. You guys will figure out if you were correct or not in your answers to those questions. So we're going to start with definitions. And as a professor, often when I'm introducing a new topic, that's what I do. I start with definitions. I think it really does lay the foundation so everybody can get on the same page. And this is a quote from Ibram Kendi's book, How to Be Anti-Racist. And I agree, I really like this quote. So it's one reason I start with it. That definitions anchor us in principles. If we don't do the basic work of defining the kind of people we want to be in language that is stable and consistent, we can't work toward stable, consistent goals. So as I said, I agree with that. We need to understand what we're talking about. We need to agree, or at least have some consensus on what the definition is. Otherwise, we don't know what we're working toward, right? So to be able to set our goals, we need to start with the definitions. So that's where we're going to start. And I'm starting with the big one, right? In terms of what is race? What does that word mean? Usually when people talk about race, they're talking about it in terms of two different constructs. There are two main ways to think about race. Most of the time when people talk about race, they're doing the first one, which is race as a biological construct. In that we think of race as something physiological, and it's defined as a group of people who share similar physical characteristics. If you think about it, we really define race from a biological perspective in terms of phenotype. You guys remember back to high school biology, and you learn the difference between phenotype and genotype. Genotype has to do with your genes or your genetic makeup. Phenotype has to do with the outward expression of those genes. So racial groupings are really based on phenotype, right? On things like color of skin, texture. I have my hair in, so you guys can't see the texture of my hair, size and shape of nose, shape of the eyes, size and shape of lips. Those phenotypic characteristics are what we do to group people into racial categories. So that's race as a biological construct. So a lot of times we assume that race is based on biology. The second way to really think about race as a sociocultural or a sociopolitical construct. And that means that we define race in terms of the characteristics, the values, and the behaviors associated with a group who share similar physical characteristics, right? It's the way we define people in terms of how they act, how they think, how they feel, and that people within these groupings share those certain common characteristics, right? And that we also use these groupings in our social interactions, and politically we use these groupings to make decisions, right? So although race may be thought of as a biological construct, we've attached a lot deeper meaning to those groupings besides just phenotype, right? We have a lot of other assumptions that underlie those groupings, expectations we have about people based on their membership in those particular groups. Okay, so let's explore this a little bit further in terms of race as a biological construct versus race as a sociocultural, sociopolitical construct. And to do that, I think it's helpful to go back to the history of this concept of race. Now, I'm not going to go through this whole history in detail, and I'm going to pause for a second because I see some comments popping up in the chat. So if you guys can monitor the chat for me, and if there's a question that comes up, if you guys can, feed me those questions, right? And so that I don't have to do like I do in class and try to monitor both. But if you guys can do that, and I'll pause every now and then and I'll check too to see if there's some important questions in the chat. So yeah, I'm not going to go through all of this in terms of history, just kind of give you the overview. But we can really connect this concept of race. It's very closely tied to the slave trade. And the slave trade, really we can talk about how the slave trade really gained momentum back in the 1400s. And it was the Portuguese who really accelerated the African slave trade back in the 1400s, right? Because the Portuguese were the first ones to take their ships and sail farther down the west coast of Africa than any of the Europeans had done before. And so Zurara, in his account in 1452, where he did a biography of Prince Henry of Portugal, and he's describing Prince Henry's, economic endeavors in terms of the slave trade. And the way Zurara describes it is, rather than doing it to make money, he said that Prince Henry was doing it to save their souls, right? And described it as how by enslaving African people and selling them into Europe, it was giving them a better lifestyle, that their lives as slaves in Europe were better than the lives that they lived in Africa, right? So really what he was doing was obscuring the fact that the Portuguese were making a lot of money off of the African slave trade. In fact, they made more money off of it than they did from taxing their citizens. So rather than really saying this is an economic endeavor, we're doing this to make money, it was hidden inside this argument, well, we're doing it to save their souls. The other thing that Zurara did is he described the captive Africans as barbarians who lived like beasts without clothes, bread, or wine, without any knowledge of how to live civil, reasonable, good lives. So notice how he's describing the African people. So that was Zurara, and that is known as sort of the first official European account of Africa. And then in 1481, that's the first time you see this word race being used, but it was actually in a poem where what de Brézé was saying, he was describing hunting dogs, right? So he used this term race to describe different breeds of hunting dogs. So that's sort of the first written account of that term race being used. And then Africanus in 1550, his account of Africa was similar to Zurara's, right? Where he's describing the African people as very beast-like and they're sexually promiscuous. And those two accounts, Africanus and Zurara, became sort of the official word in Europe on Africa and what African people were like, and became very influential. Then in 1606, that's when the first time you see the word race really used to describe groups of human beings. And that was Nicot. And that's the first time that term race was defined in a dictionary and used to refer to people. In the 17th and 18th centuries, it became popular in Europe. This is like the age of enlightenment and science. And it became popular to create these taxonomies of human beings, right? To try to group human beings into categories. And the first known one was by Petty in 1679, which he called the Scale of Humanity. But the most influential one was by Johann Friedrich Blumenbach in 1775 in his publication, The Natural Varieties of Mankind. And if you look at those terms there, those look familiar, right? Caucasian, Mongolian, Malayan, because Blumenbach's categories became the racial categories that we still use today. Okay, so that's why you hear that word Caucasian, is because that was the white group, according to Blumenbach. Mongolian, those were the yellow people. The Malayans were the brown people. The Ethiopians or the Negroes were the black people. And then the category he called American, those were the red people. So notice what else Blumenbach did is part of the categorization was based on skin tone. So again, his categorization became the most popular, and our racial categories today are still based on Blumenbach's categories. Okay. The other thing that happened historically is during this time is that these different theories were used to justify the slave trade. So for example, there was the climate theory, and climate theory said that people who live in harsh environments, like extremely cold or extremely hot, were not as fully developed as people who lived in more temperate climates, right? So again, if you lived in a very hot climate, you were not as intelligent or as civilized as people who who lived in more temperate climates. So climate theory was used to justify the slave trade. Curse theory was also used, and curse theory comes from the Torah and comes from that story of Noah and his 3 sons, right? Most of us know the story about Noah and the ark. But after that, do you guys remember the story about when Noah got drunk? Do you guys remember that story in Genesis? Noah got drunk, and I guess in his drunkenness, he took off his clothes and he passed out and he was laying naked inside his tent. And his son Ham came in and saw his father laying there drunk and naked and went and told his brothers that what he had seen. So the next morning when Noah woke up and he heard what happened, he cursed Ham. And so the legend became that the curse of Ham was black skin, that Ham was cursed with black skin, so that all dark-skinned people were descendants of Ham, and therefore all dark-skinned people were cursed. So that was another theory that was spread during this time, right? Starting from the 1400s and going into the 17th and 18th centuries. Then evangelical theory goes back to what Zerara talked about in terms of Prince Henry in Portugal and how slavery is a way of evangelizing African people, a way of improving their lives. That was another theory that was perpetuated. Beast theory, one of the things that happened with these hierarchies or these taxonomies of human beings is that they placed it in a hierarchy so that some groups of people were placed closer to the top and other groups of people were placed towards the bottom. And you can guess how that worked, right? The white European people were seen as closer to the top of the hierarchy, closer to God and the angels, whereas dark-skinned people, African people, were seen at the bottom of the hierarchy, closer to animals or beasts. So if the dark-skinned people, the African people, are more like animals, again, that's a way to justify the slave trade. And so those two kind of go together, right? Beast theory and the human hierarchies that, you know, if you're placing some groups of human beings closer to animals, lower in the hierarchy, that justifies enslaving them. So why are we talking about all this? Why are we going through all this, this history? Well, those theories were spread throughout Europe, but then they sailed across the ocean into the New World with Columbus and the other European explorers, with the Pilgrims and the early colonists, so that when the slave trade came to the Americas, so did these theories, right? These theories were used to justify the slave trade, especially in the early colonies in the US and when the US became independent, the early days of the United States. So what did these theories do? They perpetuated the racist idea that African slavery was natural, it was normal, and it was holy. And what they did is they created the racist stereotypes about Black people that still persist today. So think about that. Some of those stereotypes or some of those descriptions that Africanus and Zerara gave, that, you know, the Black African people were beast-like, they were less civilized, they were sexually promiscuous, they weren't as intelligent. All of those are still stereotypes that Black people contend with today. So that's one reason we're going through the history, is to show the influence that these ideas from hundreds of years ago still have on us today. So here's a question. We can pause here with my question, then we can also see if some of you have questions at this point. But let's start with my question, this one. So now that we just went through that history, what does it mean to say that race is socially constructed? So anybody, you guys can open your mics and go ahead and answer that question.
Well, I think it's to say that biologically, there is no difference within human beings biologically. If you look at those race constructs that you outlined before, there's nothing in the biology that supports that.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you, Zach. Exactly. And in fact, now that we have genetic mapping, so we can look at human beings genetically, what they found is that as human beings, we are 99 point something, I think it's like 99.6% or something like that, the same genetically as human beings. And that there's more variation within a racial group than there is between racial groups. Right? So there's actually more diversity genetically within a so-called racial category than there is between groups. So what does all that say? Biologically, as you just said, Zach, there is no scientific evidence to support the existence of these racial categories. From the history we just went through, you see race was constructed, right? It was a social construct from the beginning. Right? Anybody else want to share thoughts or have questions about that idea that race is socially constructed?
Lori, I'm just going to read a comment that Isika, she actually does have a question at the end of it.
Okay.
She said, I read recently that race and racism put down roots in the colonies because those in power wanted to drive a wedge between indentured workers and people who were enslaved to prevent them from joining forces and precipitating a labor revolution. Is there any validity to this memory of mine?
Yes, exactly. In fact, Ibram Kendi in his book Stamped from the Beginning documents that very carefully. So yes, that is true. They did not want the indentured servants and the slaves joining forces and revolting. Very true.
Thank you.
Sure.
Hey, I have a question.
Yes, go ahead.
I understand this idea, and when we talk about race as a social construct, and we ask people about race, and I work for a nonprofit, so we ask about race because our funding requires it and things like that. Doesn't that, it seems to continue to reinforce that there are such things as a race, like that stereotype, because it comes from a biological construct.
Right. So the reason
go ahead.
No, go ahead, Kim. What were you saying?
No, it's just, it's kind of like this catch-22. Like you want to catch people to make sure you're addressing the different types of social groups and economic groups and groups of people, but it also perpetuates that racial theory.
Yes. So one of the reasons we still have that is because of race as a sociocultural construct, that it's taken on so much meaning for us now, especially here in the United States, that we almost can't function without it, right? So think about it. When you meet someone and their race is kind of ambiguous, what do you want to ask that person? You want to ask them, well, what are you? Right? Because we almost feel like we can't interact with the person without knowing. Because we make all these assumptions about them and we have all these expectations, we want to know what they are so that we can fill in all those blanks and we know how to interact with them. So that's kind of on the interpersonal level. But yes, on a sociocultural, sociopolitical level, it's so important, right? We make lots of important decisions based on racial group categories. So it is that catch-22. It's like we've done it for so long. It's so built into our society that we almost can't function without it. But as you said, Kim, then on the flip side, what it can end up doing is perpetuating these. So within psychology, within multicultural psychology, there are actually some psychologists that argue we should do away with the term race and racial categories altogether because it is a false category, a false taxonomy. It doesn't really exist biologically. So some do argue we should get rid of it altogether.
I have a question, Dr. Barker.
Sure, go ahead, Erin.
With regards to, you were speaking earlier about how, when scientists look at, skeletal structures with the different shaped noses or, bone structures and things of that nature. I know that is obviously biologically based, but race itself is socially constructed. But what my question is with all of these 23andMe and Ancestry.com, you know, our DNA tests that we're seeing, well, where are we? Where's our DNA from? And it breaks it down. And so I just kind of wanted to know what is that telling us then exactly?
What is that telling? That's telling us about migration patterns and geographical isolation. So it is genetics, but it has to do with migration. So most scientists now agree that human beings originated in Africa, but you can actually trace genes based on where groups migrated away from Africa. So for example, those who migrated into Europe, because of geographical isolation and intermarriage, right? You get a particular gene pool with particular characteristics. Same thing for human beings who migrated into Asia and become geographically isolated, intermarry, they develop a certain gene pool, right? So that's how we end up with these different groups, is because of migration and geographical isolation. And culturally, what goes along with that, that's not just biological, it's also cultural, because those groups develop their own values, practices, and beliefs, you know, like language, food, dress, religion, all of those kinds of things, also because they are now geographically isolated from each other. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's kind of where ethnicity comes into play, right? Okay, thank you, Dr. Barker.
Sure, you're welcome. All right, did I miss anything else in the chat, Jill?
Yeah, there's one question from Kathy Commerce. Could we exchange the phrase, "What is your race?" to "Do you identify with a politically protected group?"
I suppose we could. We could change that. But my question would also be kind of like, what is it you really want to know, right? If you're trying to get to know that person and develop a relationship with that person, then ask the meaningful questions about what it is you really want to know. Does that make sense? Because my question would be, well, like, why do you need to know their race? Well, the reason you want to know their race is because you are trying to figure out, how do I interact with this person? Are we going to find similarities? Are we going to have things in common? Are we going to get along, right? Or where are differences going to be? Where might the conflicts be? There are other questions you can ask to learn that information besides, what's your race or what are you?
Well, now we have certain institutions, private enterprise, asking the question in an application process in an attempt to increase diversity in the program. So that's a hard one.
Yeah.
We want to encourage diversity, but you can't really get there without asking a question about it.
Right. And there's that double-edged sword again, right? Because of historical inequities and injustice, we ask the question because we're trying to right the past injustices. But then by asking the question, we're then perpetuating something that isn't real.
Yeah.
All right, let's keep going. Wait, I think I just saw.
Lori, Kathy Commerce has her hand up, and I don't know if it has to do with what she just put in the chat as well.
Sorry, yeah, thank you, because I can't see who's raising their hand. So go ahead.
Kathy, can you unmute and ask your question?
I said, can you hear me, Tina?
Yeah.
I just said yes, but Kim, with working with a not-for-profit, has extensive funding issues based on this issue, right? And so it's not a social thing, it's more of a political economic thing where we're trying, I mean, this is hard. I recognize that this is very hard, but there are a lot of people who are trying to undo some of the economic disprivileges based on, and I'm air quoting the word race right now, and they're trying to undo that, and it's sort of, and Kim, is that right, that you are being asked that question because of funding issues?
Yeah, I'll respond in the chat because I don't want to take anything away from Dr. Barker's discussion because I'm really interested in what she has to say, but I'll respond in the chat.
Okay,
Thanks.
Thank you, appreciate that. All right, so let's keep going with some more definitions. Okay, so what's a stereotype? A stereotype is a set of beliefs and expectations about someone simply because they belong to a particular group. And as we just pointed out, historically, those stereotypes, at least, like for African American or for Black people, started a long time ago. But we categorize people, and when we meet people, right, that's our sort of natural inclination now. We've been socialized that way. We want to place people into categories because we have these expectations, right, about how they're going to behave simply because they belong to a particular group. So that's a stereotype. It's that expectation. When you start to add an evaluative component to that stereotype, that's when it becomes prejudice. Okay, so prejudice is defined as judgments about someone simply because they belong to a particular group. So notice here, stereotypes in and of themselves aren't necessarily bad. I teach my students that stereotypes are really a cognitive shortcut that our brains take to process information, right? We're bombarded with millions of bits of information every day. Our brains try to be efficient and take shortcuts where they can. So stereotype is really a cognitive shortcut. So a stereotype in and of itself isn't necessarily bad. It's how we use that stereotype, right? So if we allow that stereotype to negatively impact our interactions with people, that's when that stereotype becomes bad. Or when we use that stereotype to make assumptions about someone that may or may not be true, right? And then if we add that evaluative component, well, that's a good thing or that's a bad thing, it becomes prejudice, right? So prejudice, when we make judgments about someone, and notice that prejudice can go both ways, right? I can be prejudiced or I can be biased in a positive direction towards someone, or I can be biased or prejudiced against somebody in a negative direction. So think about if someone comes for a job interview, and so you have two candidates for a job interview. You have a European American candidate, and let's say you have a Latinx candidate, right? My prejudice might be towards the European American candidate. So that's positive. So I may lean towards hiring that person because my prejudice is in the positive direction, versus I may be negatively biased against the Latinx person because of stereotypes that I have about Latinx people. And so I'm prejudiced in the negative direction and may be less likely to hire that person because they are Latinx and because of the stereotypes they have. So when you add that evaluative component, it's positive, it's negative, that's when it becomes prejudice. And then if you take it a step further and you act on it, that's when it becomes discrimination. So discrimination is negative behavior towards members of a group. So in that scenario I just gave about if I'm an employer and I'm trying to hire someone, if I am prejudiced against the Latinx person and I do not hire that person because of that prejudice, that is discrimination because now I've acted on my prejudice, right? That is a behavior I'm now engaging in that has a negative impact on that person because of my prejudice. So when you act on it, it's discrimination. And then here is a definition of racism. I'm saying it's one definition. I'm going to give you guys some more, but here's one. That racism is discrimination backed by institutional power. That racism is discrimination backed by institutional power. So if I discriminate, if I treat someone negatively because of my prejudice against them or against their group, and my actions are backed up by the power structure, that has now become racism. And an example of this would be, let's say, racial profiling in policing, right? So an individual police officer may racially profile, right? And they see the Latinx person driving and they pull them over, right? Because a Latinx person, they're probably doing something wrong. Most of them are criminals, right? The stereotypes, the prejudice, I pull them over. And the system now backs that officer up in having pulled that Latinx person over. So because they have the institution backing them up in that behavior, it's now become racism. Okay, so that's one way of defining racism. So does that make sense though, this progression here? how you move from stereotypes to prejudice to discrimination to racism? All right, I'm seeing the head nods, so I'm going to take that as a yes. So I told you that's one definition of racism. And if you look here, I'm going to use the biopsychosocial model to actually define for you that there are different types of racism. And I think a lot of times when people get into arguments or heated discussions about race and racism, it's because they're really arguing about two different types of racism, two or more. Because a lot of times people will say, oh, that's racist. And then the person will come back and be like, I'm not racist. I don't have a racist bone in my body. I see everybody as equal. Well, you're really talking about you could be talking about two different types of racism. The person's getting defensive based on a personal level, like I personally am not racist. Well, just because you personally aren't racist does not mean racism doesn't exist, right? Racism can still exist on these other levels, like the social institutional level, like at the cultural level. Okay, so let's try to understand what that means here. So let me give you a quick explanation of the biopsychosocial model first. Notice that you have 5 different levels here in the biopsychosocial model. At the center of the model, at the most basic level, is the biological level, right? So we can explain behavior based on biology or physiology. Then the next level is the cognitive affective level. We can explain behavior based on cognition, which has to do with our thoughts or our mental processes. And we can explain behavior based on affect, which refers to our emotions or our feelings. So that's the second level. The third level, we can explain behavior based on our relationships, which is the social interpersonal level, or how we impact each other through our relationships or through our social interactions. And then the fourth level is social institutional. How do these big social institutions, we can name the institutions, right? Like the military, the government, the educational system, the healthcare system, the church, right? All of these are these big social institutions, and these institutions have an impact on us as individuals. And then the cultural level has to do with those bigger things like the values, the practices, the beliefs of a group of people, right? What are the underlying assumptions within that culture that sort of influence and shape how things are done within that culture? So let me go through a real quick example to demonstrate these different levels. So let's take depression. We could explain depression at each of these levels, right? So from the biological level, we could say that depression is caused by a chemical imbalance in the brain, right? That your neurotransmitter levels are off, and that's what causes the person to be depressed. That'd be a biological explanation of depression. I could also give a cognitive affective explanation for depression, meaning depressed people tend to think very negatively, right? They may be hopeless, or they feel helpless, or they believe that life has nothing good in store for them. So they have a negative way of thinking. That's the cognitive part. And they have negative feelings, right? The affect, they feel depressed, they feel sad. So there's that affective component of depression. And so there are theories that talk about how those things drive depression, the way the person thinks, the way the person feels. We can also explain depression socially from a social interpersonal, right? So if you've had a breakup of a relationship, you've got your boss is stressing you out at work, you're having conflicts with coworkers, you've lost a loved one, those all have to do with relationships. And if something goes wrong in those relationships, that can cause you to feel depressed. All right, so all of those were probably pretty easy to understand so far, but what about social institutional? How do social institutions make you feel depressed? Well, have any of you had to stand in line at the DMV? Did you feel depressed after you had to stand in line at the DMV? Or have any of you had to deal with the healthcare system and trying to, get an appointment with a doctor or be able to see a specialist or, get your prescriptions? So having to deal with those kinds of social institutions can affect our mood, right? Can affect our emotional and mental state. And then from a cultural level, can we explain depression from a cultural level? Well, yes, there can be things going on in our culture as a whole that lead us to feel depressed, okay? All right, so that's my quick and dirty explanation of the biopsychosocial model. What in the world does that have to do with racism? Well, we can define the different types of racism using these different levels. So from a cognitive affective level, that's actually racism at the individual level, or what we just defined as prejudice, right? So if I personally have negative thoughts, negative beliefs, negative feelings about people from a particular group, that's my own prejudice, that's my own individual racism. That's the cognitive affective level. If I act on that, that's how we describe discrimination, right? We could also think of that as interpersonal racism. If I treat people differently because they belong to a particular group, that now becomes interpersonal racism, or what we just defined as discrimination. Racism can also occur at the institutional level. And this is another sort of buzzword that's been going on in the wake of George Floyd, right? Institutional racism or structural racism. You'll hear that sometimes too. Another word for that would be oppression, or the definition that I just gave on the previous slide, where racism is discrimination backed by institutional power. That's occurring at this level, right? So that example I gave of racial profiling amongst police, that's an example of institutional racism, because it's that discrimination, it's backed by institutional power. Then what about at the cultural level? That yes, there can be such a thing as cultural racism, meaning racism is so embedded in the fabric of our society that we almost don't even notice it. Right? It's so common, it happens every single day that we don't even notice it. Here's an example of that. How often do you use the terms Black or dark to describe something negative? You guys thought of that? It's a dark day. I'm in a dark mood. Bad guys wear black, good guys wear white. We don't even stop to think how our language is actually biased in that direction, right? Where things that are negative are dark or black, and things that are positive are white or light or bright. Something that's so much part of what we do in our culture every single day that we don't even notice it. That's an example of cultural racism.
Hey, Lori, just to add to that, a long time ago, I watched a couple episodes of this show called Say Yes to the Dress, this stupid reality show. But
I'm guilty. I've watched it, Jill.
about that when you said that, because when women get married, they wear a white dress, right? And the brides that come in and want to blow out the system to wear a black dress are portrayed on that show as like oddballs.
Yes.
Like, you want to wear a black dress to get married?
And it's interesting because here in the United States, in our culture, to funerals, we wear black or a dark color, right? That's traditional. Do you know what color they wear to funerals in Africa? In many African countries? White.
White, probably white.
They wear white to a funeral. So it's like whatever is opposite of you is what death is.
In Japan too.
In Japan, they wear white to funerals. Yeah. All right.
Dr.
Any
Booker,
questions? Oh, sorry. Yeah, go ahead, Zach.
Yeah, I just wanted to say I particularly appreciate how you have a few kind of definitions here with an eye towards nuance. I mean, I kind of think the debate that was going around a year ago was kind of redactive in a way. I mean, I think, like Robin DiAngelo talked a lot about it in White Fragility, that racism has to be backed by power. Ibram Kendi went through in his book detail about when he was at Texas A&M, he and his crew of friends, they were racists looking back, right? They were really anti-white people. And it's confusing to a lot of people to say, if a Black person says, I can't be racist, that's very confusing. And personally, I'm not sure true. I buy your definitions here more. You've added a lot of nuance to it. And I know, was it Merriam or Webster? One of them changed the definition of racism in their last edition of the dictionary to include that it has to be backed by power. So sounds like this is a debate that's going to continue, but I appreciate what you've done here.
Thank you. Thank you.
Me
Yeah.
too. Yeah, you actually took the words right out of my mouth, because I also have recently, seen commentary about that, how one cannot be racist against a marginalized, race if they themselves are not in a race of power. And I got confused by that as well. So thank you, Dr. Burr. This is very helpful.
Sure, you're welcome. I'm glad it's helpful. Yeah, and like I said, I think that is part of the conflict, is that people want to just use one definition, where it is, as you said, Zach used the word nuance. It is much more nuanced than that. There isn't just one type of racism. There isn't just one definition. There are several. And I'm going to give you more. You guys want some more? More definitions. We can also divide racism into modern racism versus old-fashioned racism. Old-fashioned racism is what we say is like racism that hits you in the face, right? So somebody calling someone a racial epithet, or beating somebody up because of their race. That's like old-fashioned racism. Whereas modern racism is more nuanced. And what some psychologists argued is that racism, especially, leading up to the Obama era and during the Obama era, people wanted to say, oh, look, we're in a post-racial society. We've moved past it. We're over that stuff now. We don't have to talk about racism anymore. But what many psychologists argued is that racism didn't go away, it just changed forms, right? It wasn't the old-fashioned over in your face racism anymore. It went underground and became much more subtle, much more deniable, much more nuanced. So what does that look like? Again, we just said overt racism is the old-fashioned racism. So that's openly engaging in hostile acts toward racial minorities. And if somebody, I'm forgetting who it was, mentioned a term, instead of asking someone, what's your race, can we change the term? Well, I should change this, because we actually stay away from saying racial minorities. And I heard one I just loved the other day. It was people of the global majority, right? Instead of saying people of color, let's say people of the global majority, because if you count, there are more people of color in the globe than there are white people. So when we say minorities referring to people of color, that's actually not accurate. Because if you put all people of color together around the world, they form a majority. So anyway, that was a little bit of a sidetrack. So overt racism versus covert racism, which is that racism that seems more subtle and even deniable, right? So people won't, if I go back to my example of the employer who's looking to hire some new employees, that employer is not going to, probably isn't going to come right out and say, I don't want to hire the Latinx person because I don't like Latinx people. I think they're lazy and they make lousy workers. They're not going to say that. That would be old-fashioned kind of racism. But they're going to sort of wrap it up in a nice package and be like, well, the Latinx worker just wasn't as well qualified, right? So well qualified is, buzzword for, I don't want to hire the Latinx person. So covert racism, it's become more subtle and even deniable. And this gets divided up into intentional versus unintentional covert racism. So there are people who engage in these covert racist acts and they know that's what they're doing. So the employer who knowingly on the inside is like, yeah, I just don't like Latinx people, so I'm not going to hire the Latinx person. That's intentional. But a lot of times it's unintentional. again, remember that idea of cultural racism? It's just become so embedded in our culture that we're not even aware. So that idea that I may be acting in a racist way, but I don't even recognize that that's what I'm doing. Okay, that's covert, unintentional racism that you may be very well meaning, but you don't recognize that it's still having the same effect. It's still racist, right? And so another term or type of covert racism, and this is the term many of you may have heard about already, and maybe have done some reading about it, is implicit bias, right? Implicit racial bias. It's a form of covert, unintentional racism. So let's talk about implicit racial bias for a minute and what we know. There's been a lot of research on it. As I said, some of you may be familiar with this concept already, but just to review real quick from the literature, what do we know already about implicit bias? So here's the definition. Implicit bias, it's unconscious judgments we hold about someone because they belong to a particular group, right? Unconscious judgments. So it's out of our conscious awareness. It includes attitudes that we have about other people based on certain characteristics. The one we're focusing on today is race, but we can have implicit biases about people based on other things like their age, their appearance, their physical ability, etc. And these biases, as we said, prejudice can be both favorable and unfavorable. Bias can go both ways. And that these are activated involuntarily and without our awareness or our intentional control. So again, it's implicit, it's unconscious, something that we cannot consciously control without some effort. They are pervasive. We all have them. I talk to my students about how you cannot, especially in the United States, you cannot live in the United States for any period of time and not have some biases, some prejudices, some stereotypes. We all fall prey to it. These biases develop over our lifetime, both through direct and indirect messages that we get, right? From our family, from the media, from our life experiences, and they affect our behavior. So even though we're not consciously aware of it, these implicit biases do impact our behavior. However, they are malleable, right? So even though they are out of our conscious awareness, as I mentioned, with some effort, you can become more conscious of them. And once you become more conscious, you can work to change them or undo them. They can gradually be unlearned. A lot of this work comes out of Project Implicit at Harvard University, and I would suggest, have any of you taken the implicit bias test online?
I love that. It's so much fun.
Yeah, so it is. I'm glad you said that, Erin. It is fun. I mean, I'm a psychology nerd, so I think it's
Me
fun.
too. Yeah.
But yeah, so if you just Google Project Implicit Harvard University, it comes up, and they have implicit bias tests, not just on race, but on tons of different things that you can take, and you can get your own score to see if you have implicit bias, which we all do, right? We all have them. So it is. I think it's kind of fun. And some of this information also comes out of the Kirwan Institute at Ohio State. So that kind of summarizes, as I said, we have a lot of research on implicit bias right now. And as I've said a couple times, we all have implicit biases because that's just how our brains work. All right, so here's another pause with a question. What are some examples of implicit bias that you guys have? Any examples of these unconscious biases that we're not completely aware of? You might be thinking, how can I answer that question if I'm not aware of doing it? But have any of you become aware of some of your implicit biases?
I feel like I'm talking too much, but
No, you're okay, Erin, go ahead.
Okay. I just put in the chat, but I was just thinking sometimes we have negative implicit bias towards our own identities too, without knowing it. And my example was a gay person maybe holding, you know, homophobic thoughts and, you know, not realizing it necessarily, you know, against ourselves.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Erin. Anybody else have examples? I thought maybe Aaron would have broken the ice there. Somebody else can share one. Well, I actually have one. Maybe my own story will break the ice. So just as you said, Aaron, we can have these biases against our own group. So there was a day where I went to the car wash, took my car to have it washed. And, as I left my car and I went to the waiting area, there were a lot of, I think it was like a Friday. And so there were a lot of people there getting their cars washed. And so as I looked around for somewhere to sit, there was an open seat. But I looked, and sitting right next to that open seat was a young African-American man, and he was slouched down in the chair. He had his baseball cap turned to the side. He had his pants sagging down. He had the tennis shoes on that weren't laced up. And my initial instinct, right, and it happened in a split second, that my thought was, don't sit there, right? That was my own bias against my own group and my own stereotypes about young African-American men who are dressed like that, right? But partly because I've been doing this work my whole life, pretty much, I caught myself and I told myself, don't do that. And I sat down in that chair next to that young man. And as a professor back in the day when, I carried my papers around with me everywhere. And so anytime I'm sitting somewhere, I pull them out and I'm grading papers. So I did that. I pulled my papers out of my bag and my purple pen and I start grading papers. And he says to me, are you a teacher? And I said, yes, I am. And he said, well, where do you teach? I said, I teach at Cal Poly Pomona. And he goes, oh, I go to UCR. And I said, oh, you do? I go, what are you studying there? And so we start having this whole conversation, right? Blew my own stereotypes out of the water. He was a student at UCR. I don't remember what he was, something like economics or something that he was studying. And so we sat there and we had this great conversation while we're both waiting for our cars to get washed, right? Shame on me for my own implicit bias, right? But that, like the quote on the screen says, we all have them. It's how our brains work. And on the previous screen, it said, it comes from our life experiences and how we absorb these messages throughout our lifetimes, right? From the media, from family members, from friends, from our own experiences, right? So I'm just as susceptible to the media portrayal of young African-American men who walk around with their pants sagging, their shoes untied, and their cap turned to the side. I'm just as susceptible to those stereotypes as everybody else. Okay, so that's my own story about my own implicit bias. Can anybody else think of an example?
Well, I
Go
know
ahead, Zach.
we tend to have an implicit bias towards people who have a background like our own or have an upbringing like our own. It happens all the time in interviewing. You see a particular university on the application or it comes up and you, without even recognizing that you've done it, you've already made all these assumptions about the person, that they're fantastic or that they're no good. Or if you were to find out that they didn't go to college, you make all these negative assumptions about them. But the reason they maybe didn't go to college is because they come from abject poverty and maybe they've, right. So you don't know, but you have all these implicit biases and jump to conclusions.
Right,
It's easy.
exactly.
Brain
It's
works.
very
Like
easy. Yes, thank you. It's very easy. All right, so some of you have read Ibram Kendi's book, How to Be Anti-Racist. So, this is his definition of a racist. It's one who is supporting a racist policy through their actions or inaction or expressing a racist idea. And that's really his whole thing, is going back through that history of race. He's saying that people had policies first, or they had practices first. So for example, selling African bodies, right? is the practice that you're already engaged in. And so you develop these ideas to support that practice, right? You develop the racist ideas. So you develop the idea that African people are beasts, they're less intelligent, you're saving their souls, they're cursed, etc. You develop these ideas to support what you're already doing. And then those ideas take on the life of their own. So he's saying the racist is a person who supports these kinds of racist policies, either through their action or their inaction, right? Or someone who expresses a racist idea. If we simplify his definition of a racist, it's one who endorses a racial hierarchy, going back to that same idea of human hierarchies, where you believe that some people are higher up in the hierarchy than others. What does that mean? Some people are more intelligent, some people are more attractive, some people are more cultured, more civilized than others, right? You're placing people in that hierarchy. That is racism. So then he defines the anti-racist as one who's supporting an anti-racist policy through their actions or expressing an anti-racist idea. So if we simplify that definition, it's one who endorses racial equality. So if through your policies, through your actions, you endorse that idea of everyone being equal, right? Even if there are differences, a difference isn't better than another, it's just different, right? Then you are behaving like an anti-racist. You endorse equality. Everybody is the same, no matter what group they belong to. And then he defines a non-racist as someone who is neutral and does not hold any racist ideas or actions, but this is what he does. He says, not possible. According to Kendi, he says it's not possible to be non-racist and to say that you're neutral and you don't have any racist ideas or actions, especially here in the United States, right? Because we went through the history from the very beginning of this country. It was founded on racist ideas to support the slave trade, which came over in those early days of the colonies. So it's not possible to be here in the United States and not be influenced by those ideas. So he says, you're one or the other. You are either a racist or you are an anti-racist. Now, not everybody agrees with that. That is Kendi's idea, but something for us to think about, that it's not possible. And then here's one of my heroes, Desmond Tutu, who is known as the Martin Luther King, and he's still alive. He's old. He's in his 80s. And sorry, side note, I actually had the opportunity to meet him when I was in South Africa. It was one of my life highlights because I was one of those college students out there in the 80s, protesting apartheid. So when I got to meet Desmond Tutu, that was amazing. But this is a quote from him, one of my heroes. He said, "If you are neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor." So the same idea as Kendi is that it's not possible to be neutral and try and stay in the middle. You are one or you are the other. All right, so here's some more questions. Here's a question. What are some examples of racist policies? So go ahead, you guys can open up your mics and share. Can you think of an example? And it could be historical or it could be present, either one.
And I don't think she can do it, right?
I don't know.
Is somebody sharing one?
Yeah, go ahead, Ruth.
The GI Bill was not offered to African-American soldiers when they returned.
Yes, thank you, Ruth. Great example, right? The GI Bill was not offered to African-American soldiers when they came back. Yes, thank you. Any others?
What about voter suppression laws?
That is a current one going on right now, right? Yes, voter suppression laws.
Yeah.
I see in the chat, the war on drugs, yes, definitely affected people of color more than other groups. So for example, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, it's Kathy talking. It's the land ownership and the banks lending.
Mhm. Yes, banks not giving loans to people of color. Yes,
Yep.
or not, and real estate agents not selling homes to people of color in certain neighborhoods.
Actually, also women not getting the same pay as men for the same position.
Thank you.
Mhm. Yes, we would call that's a sexist policy. Absolutely.
Yeah.
But we are against that one too.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Gerrymandering as well.
Yes, gerrymandering, redlining. Well, the redlining was the real estate, but yes, gerrymandering is in politics, right? In creating the voting districts, trying to get people of, if it gets heavily too much one race or another, they're going to gerrymander, they're going to move those lines to try to change that. All right, then what are some examples of anti-racist policies, either past or present?
Carolyn Mormuso has listed fair housing laws.
Yes, fair housing laws.
What about affirmative action?
Absolutely, affirmative action, which has been under attack, right? So we could say trying to undo affirmative action would be a racist policy, but passing affirmative action would be anti-racist. Voting rights amendment, I see that in the chat. Yes, absolutely. All right, so good. So we can come up with examples of both of those. So your question might be, okay, now what? we've gone through all these definitions, increased our understanding by having all this information, looking at it historically, looking at it currently, et cetera. So what do we do? What do we do with all of this information? Now what? So Kendi, in his book, How to Be Anti-Racist, which some of you have read, lays out these steps for how someone can become anti-racist. He says, stop using the I'm not a racist or I can't be racist, right? Stop denying, because as he said, it's actually, according to him, not possible. You can't be non-racist. Either you are a racist or you are anti-racist. So he's saying, stop using that defense. And then he's saying, admit the definition of racist or someone who's supporting racist policies or expressing racist ideas. So if we looked at it today, let's say with the attack on voting rights, right, voter suppression laws, people who support those laws would be racist because they are supporting laws that would limit the ability for more diverse people to have access to voting and being able to vote. Whereas if you support more voting rights, policies that support voting rights, then you would be anti-racist, okay? All right, confess the racist policies I support and racist ideas I express. As we said, we all have them. So being aware of them, admitting them is a step in the anti-racist direction. Accept their source, where those things came from. We talked about how they come from our upbringing inside this country that was built on racist ideas and policies. We are all susceptible. We've all been influenced by them. Acknowledge the definition of the anti-racist, someone who's supporting those policies, expressing those ideas. We said that already. And he continues his steps. These are a little bit longer, mainly because he's giving examples for how to do these things. He says, struggle for anti-racist power and policy in my spaces. And he gives some examples, right? Be in a policymaking position. Sometimes some of us in our jobs are in policymaking positions, right? We can impact policy at our institutions, in our places of worship, right? Joining an anti-racist organization or protest, publicly donating your time or your funds to anti-racist causes, organizations, right? The next one, we can struggle to remain at the anti-racist intersections where racism is mixed with other bigotries. So yeah, we talk a lot now in multicultural psych about intersectionality, meaning our different identities. So Jill brought up gender a minute ago. I think Erin brought up sexual orientation. So for example, I am African-American, but I'm also female. So there's an intersection between my race and gender, and the things that I face as an African-American female are not the same as the things that an African-American male faces. So for example, people aren't necessarily scared of me as an African-American female. You might feel intimidated by me because of some of the stereotypes about African-American women, but you don't necessarily fear for your life from me as an African-American female. Whereas with an African-American male, people fear for their lives. People fear for their safety because of the stereotypes about African-American males. So that's an example of how intersectionality, how the intersection of those identities impacts people differently. Okay, so that's what he's talking about here, to be aware of those other identities, as some of you brought up. So aware of things like sexual orientation, gender, socioeconomic status, right? So understanding that all of those identities intersect and impact people. And then the last one he has here, struggle to think with anti-racist ideas, right? Change the way you think about things. So seeing the inequities, seeing the group differences, not being fooled by misleading statistics or theories, right? Again, in the media, we're bombarded with them all the time. We get two totally different interpretations of the same event, right? One side says it's this, the other side says it's that. Well, both sides are probably biased. So it's like, we need to make sure we're doing our own research, making sure we're getting accurate information, challenging ideas, right? Okay, so these are Kendi's suggestions for how to be anti-racist. This is how he lays it out. Here's a graphic that I found online that I really like, because it shows that becoming anti-racist is a process, and it defines, these different zones that people move through. So, people typically start out in the fear zone, and look at some of the descriptions there. I avoid the hard questions. I strive to be comfortable. I talk to others who look like me and think like me. I deny that racism is a problem. So if people are there, that's described here as the fear zone. But then if you're working at this, you move into what's described here as the learning zone. And look at some of the descriptors here. I recognize that racism is a present and current problem. I seek out questions that make me uncomfortable. I understand my own privilege in ignoring racism. I educate myself about race and structural racism. I'm vulnerable about my own biases and knowledge gaps. I listen to others who think and look differently than me, right? So you get into that learning space, the learning zone. And then what that does is that moves you into the growth zone. And look what's described here as growth. And notice there's no end point, right? The arrow points that you can keep going, and it's a growth zone. It doesn't say end zone, like you've arrived, but, and I like the term becoming. I'm becoming anti-racist. It's a lifelong process that you commit to and you go through. So look at the growth zone. I identify how I may unknowingly benefit from racism. I promote and advocate for policies and leaders that are anti-racist. I sit with my discomfort. And that's a saying that I have for my students is get comfortable being uncomfortable. Okay? You got to get comfortable being uncomfortable, or we'll never be able to move forward. We'll never be able to have change. I speak out when I see racism in action, right? Using our voices and speaking up. I think Jill and I, have had a number of conversations in the wake of George Floyd. And I think, Jill, I don't know if it was you or someone else, I know I said it to Erica in our department, but that, you know, I speak out on these issues all the time, but especially after George Floyd, I was like, you know what? I'm not going to be quiet anymore, because there's some times where I will sit and be quiet and, you know, not say something, but that was sort of my commitment. Like, you know what, the spaces that I'm in, the opportunities that I have, I'm not going to be quiet anymore. I'm going to speak up and I'm going to say something, right? So I speak out. I educate my peers how racism harms our profession, right? And that could go beyond just profession. I educate my peers about how it harms our worship community, right? Our family, our school, whatever it is. I don't let mistakes deter me from being better, right? Yes, mistakes will be made. That's okay. That's just part of the learning process. I use the metaphor of riding a bike or learning how to skate, right? When you learn to ride a bike, you're going to fall down, or when you're learning how to skate, you're going to fall down. That's the only way you get better, is that you get up and you keep going. So mistakes will be made, and that's okay. Learn from them and keep going. I yield positions of power to those otherwise marginalized. And sometimes that can be hard, you know, to let those who historically or traditionally or even currently have not had the power, not had the voice, to share the power or turn the power over, right, to those people, to those groups. And I surround myself with others who think and look differently than me, right? Get out of our comfort zones. Robin DiAngelo talks about that in her book, White Fragility, right? That's one of her big suggestions, is get out there and make friends with people who are different from you, right? Spend time with people who are different from you. All right, and then this, yes, go ahead, Philip.
An observation and a question. When you were talking about implicit bias, I realized one of mine has to do with our synagogue, and that is when I'm there and a person who is not Caucasian walks in, I presume that they're a visitor, and I don't assume that they may be Jewish and part of our religion. And the question, if it's not going to throw us off topic, is could you spend a moment talking about critical race theory, because it comes up a lot in the news?
Yes, and you know what, I'm gonna hold that question, Philip, until after I finish this, because we're gonna have plenty of time left still for sort of open dialogue and questions. So I'm gonna hold that one for a second about critical race theory. But your example, thank you for that example of implicit bias. Exactly, that a person of color walks into the synagogue and you assume they are not Jewish, or you assume that they are a visitor, when yes, there are Jewish people around the globe, right? There are Jewish communities all around the globe. So thank you for sharing that one.
Just to add to that, Philip, I sent to Steve and I forget who else, I think Tina, a hour and a half video I just watched on Jews of color from the Hebrew Union College, and Rabbi Bookdahl in the Central Synagogue. I adore her. She actually is a Korean woman, and she's a rabbi, but she talks a lot about the discrimination that she's felt, even being a rabbi. But she told this story in this seminar I watched about this African-American man who actually, and Central Synagogue is a big synagogue in New York. I mean, I think they have like 1,200 families, not now, during COVID, but it's big. And she said there was an African-American man that came up to her and said, I don't understand this. I've come here every week. He's there every week in the services, and every week somebody in the synagogue says to him, where are you from? Who are you? He gets questions, whereas in the same, and I can share the link with you, the same episode, a researcher I forget, he's in one of the schools here in Southern California, talked about the numbers of Jews of color around the globe. And it's not that small. So it's only in the United States, I think, that, we make this assumption, and your bias comes out of reality, right? If you look in our services, there aren't that many Jews of color, but their point was they're there, they're just not coming to synagogue. which is sad. So
Interesting. Thank you. I actually have a personal story related to that. Some friends of ours who were Jewish, their son was having his bar mitzvah and they invited us to come. And so I think we were the only Black people there at the bar mitzvah. So, and forgive me my ignorance about the traditions, but isn't there a part of the service where the rabbi takes the scroll and goes around the room and has
Yes.
people touch the scroll,
Yes.
right?
Yes, yes.
So the rabbi went around for everybody to touch it except us.
Really?
Yeah. So he just kind of went right past us, and it was like, okay. So yeah, so the assumption was that, I guess, we weren't Jewish, so we weren't going to participate in the tradition.
Seth, you have your hand up. That's really sad, Lori. I'll bring my little Torah to work and you can kiss it.
Two things. One, Jill, but before I forget, are they not coming to synagogue at all, or are they just not coming to our synagogue?
Oh no! In this video I watched, they were just not coming to synagogue. No, not
Okay.
ours.
Okay.
It just was because this was in New York, and the person that was commenting was just saying that trying to make a conclusion between here are the numbers of Jews of color, but where are they in synagogues in general?
Got it.
Yeah.
Because I didn't get around to watching that video yet. I do intend to. And Lori, I have been to synagogues. I have carried the Torah in what's called the Hakafah, which is the procession you were talking about. And I have had the rabbi, not in our synagogue, but in other synagogues, walk behind me and tell me who wasn't Jewish and not to allow them to touch the Torah. So, of course, they didn't know that you weren't Jewish, just by looking at you. We have had Black members of our congregation in Glendale. But, so there's no reason for them to just look at you and know that you're not Jewish. But, so I don't know where to come down on that.
Yeah.
They should have asked rather than making the assumption, certainly.
Yeah, so as you can see, I took it in stride. I'm laughing about it and joking about it now. I mean, I understood probably the intention behind it, right? But it was the assumption, right? The assumption, I'm not Jewish, but it was the assumption that I wasn't, simply by looking at us. That was my guess. So thank you all. Thank you for sharing. So this is my own, in the wake of George Floyd and in sort of conversations, and I call it like Facebook activism, people on Facebook kept asking me, and not just Facebook, but in everyday conversations and in, at work and things like that, people kept saying, well, what can we do? What can we do? We want to know what we can do. And so I started posting things on Facebook, and then people asked, hey, can you put all of these suggestions together? And this is what I came up with. I came up with these 5 steps of things that people can do, right? If we are working towards social justice in general, but anti-racism in particular, since that's what we're talking about today, these are the 5 steps that I kind of distilled. Step 1 is to change yourself, right? We have to look at ourselves first. That's where the work begins. Educate yourself. You guys are already doing that by attending this discussion that we're having this evening, right? That you came hoping to learn something, right? Get some more information. Many of you raised your hands that you've already read some of the books in my suggested reading list. That's educating yourself. There's so much information out there nowadays, which is a good thing, right? That you can do a lot to educate yourself and to be reflective, right? The only way we become aware of our implicit biases is to do that reflective work and to think about it, to be aware and then be able to make the changes. And then step 2, use your voice. As you're educating yourself, educate those who are around you. Have those crucial conversations. I told you one of the commitments I made was I'm not being quiet anymore. I'm gonna speak up more. I'm gonna have those conversations with people, even though they can be difficult conversations, they can be uncomfortable. But again, we're never going to make progress. We're never going to move forward unless we're willing to get outside our comfort zones. So, right, practice getting comfortable being uncomfortable and speaking up and using your voice in your spaces, in your spheres of influence. Step 3 is the policy work, right? Insist that officials and politicians make significant systemic changes. The example I used earlier was about racial profiling, which really what we're talking about in the wake of George Floyd is racism in policing in general. And a lot of people sort of got afraid with the phrase defund the police. People like, how can we do that? We can't defund the police. Well, the meaning behind that phrase, defund the police, is really we need systemic change in policing in the United States, right? That we need to do something drastic to change policing in the United States so that we can stop having more George Floyds and Breonna Taylors and Rayshard Brooks and Dante Moores. I don't want the list to keep growing. It needs to stop. So, doing the work to try to make sure that happens is important. That's the policy work. That's step 3. And that step 4 is stay vigilant. Remember what I said towards the beginning of our discussion today is that social movements go in cycles. That, in the wake of George Floyd, we had a crest in the wave. Everybody, not everybody, large numbers of people were on board and got involved in the movement. And that wave is sort of starting to recede right now, but it never goes away completely. There are always people doing this kind of work. It's just that sometimes something happens to move them into the public eye or to move them forward or more people join in. But there are always people doing the work, and that's what we have to do. We have to stay vigilant. We have to keep the pressure on. It can't just be when something sort of sensational happens. It has to be in those in-between times that we also keep working. And step 5, which sort of, relates to all of these, but organize. Ibram Kendi and his suggested steps toward being anti-racist, he talks about that, joining organizations, volunteering your time, donating your funds, whatever it is to get involved in organizations or to support the organizations that are doing this kind of work to make a difference. So these are my sort of simplified steps to help you know what you can do. And so here's my call to action. I want you to describe, or to at least think about, commit to one thing that you will do as you continue to grow toward becoming anti-racist. So you don't have to share it with us right now, but I definitely want you to take a moment to reflect. And this evening, maybe before you go to bed tonight, pick something, commit to something that you're going to do different as you work toward becoming anti-racist and as we work towards changing our society. So I'm going to end this sort of more formal part of our discussion with a quote from another one of my heroes, or Shiro, Angela Davis. And the first quote there says, "I am no longer accepting the things I cannot change. I am changing the things I cannot accept." And she also said, "You have to act as if it were possible to radically transform the world, and you have to do it all the time." And I am an optimist. I'm crazy enough to believe that we can transform the world. And maybe not the whole world, but at least our space in this world. So I want to encourage and motivate and inspire, hopefully, all of you to do the same. So I am going to stop sharing my screen at this point so we can all see each other and just open it up for open discussion, questions, comments, anything. So actually we had a question already. Should I go back to Philip's question?
Oh, right, to the, yeah.
Race. Now, not an expert on critical race theory, but the simplified explanation of critical race theory, it actually started in the legal world. So technically it's a legal term. It's a theory that's taught in some law schools. And essentially what it's saying is let's look at our history as a country through a racial lens. So for example, was it Ruth who mentioned the GI Bill? I think it wasn't mentioned the GI Bill. That if you look at the history, let's say of World War II, there's one way to look at the GI Bill and how many soldiers came home were able to get GI Bill. But if you only tell that version of history, you're leaving out the part about how black soldiers returned from World War II. Not only did they not benefit from the GI Bill, well, the GI Bill allowed things in terms of education, in terms of housing, etc. Black veterans did not benefit from that. So
Lori, I'm not sure what the issue is, but we didn't get the sound was bad for your discussion on critical race theory. Can you hear me, Tina?
Yeah, I can hear you fine. So I think it's something with Lori's mic or something.
you guys hear me now?
No.
Yeah, but it's all garbled.
You know what I'm gonna do? I'm gonna log out and then log back in.
Okay, that sounds good.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay.
So Tina, while she's logging back out and back in, how do you want to handle the questions? Because I can't see the people's hands or keep order like Rabbi Rick usually does.